Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a genuinely mind-blowing piece of global history. We're going to look at exactly how a private trading company managed to systematically engineer the colonization of an entire subcontinent literally over the course of a single century. We'll be zooming in on the period right between 1757 and 1857, and we're going to trace the exact blueprints the British East India Company used to build an empire.
Seriously, how does a corporation conquer a country? Okay, let's dive into this. Because when you take a step back and really think about it, the sheer historical absurdity of a mega corporation ruling a nation of millions is just staggering. I mean, imagine a modern multinational tech or shipping company suddenly possessing its own army, writing its own laws, and collecting taxes from an entire country. No way, right? Well, how did they actually pull this off?
To understand this, here's our roadmap for The Explainer. First, a century of corporate rule. Second, drafting the colonial constitution. Third, shaping Indian minds. Fourth, extracting the wealth. And finally, the road to 1857.
Section 1. A century of corporate rule, from trade to territory.
Section 2. Drafting the colonial constitution, the legal pillar.
You see, between 1757 and 1857, the East India Company basically went rogue. They became a profit-driven state. The British Parliament quickly realized they had to rein them in, mostly because you simply cannot rule an expanding empire without a rigid, centralized legal framework. So let's walk through this timeline together. It starts with the 1773 Regulating Act, which created the Governor-General and a Supreme Court. Then the 1784 Pitt's India Act set up a board of control all the way back in London. Fast forward to 1813 and 1833, and the company's trade monopolies were systematically abolished. Finally, the 1853 Charter Act introduced an imperial legislative council. So with every passing decade, Parliament was actively stripping the company of its commercial identity, transforming it into a full-fledged governing state.
And the ultimate proof of this massive power centralization, it's literally in a simple title change. Back in 1773, Warren Hastings was known as the Governor-General of Bengal. But by 1833, Lord William Bentinck took on the title of the first Governor-General of India. That's a huge shift. The British were no longer just regional administrators. They were officially claiming jurisdiction over the entire subcontinent.
But hold on, here is the million-dollar question. Once you've established the legal and bureaucratic right to rule on paper, how do you actually get millions of subjects to accept it? I mean, laws and courts can only get you so far, right? Eventually, you have to start shaping this society itself.
Section 3. Shaping Indian minds, the ideological pillar.
For decades, there was this intense debate within the company about how, or even actually if, they should educate the Indian masses. This all culminated in a highly calculated, kind of insidious concept called the infiltration theory. The government basically decided they wouldn't educate everyone. Instead, they'd grant modern English education only to the top strata of society, hoping it would just sort of filter downward over time. In reality, it was a deliberate strategy to create a distinct buffer class between the handful of British rulers and their millions of Indian subjects.
Now, what's really interesting about these historical notes is how they detail the 1835 Macaulay Minute. Lord Macaulay was the one who forcefully championed English as the official medium of instruction. He drove the whole adoption of this infiltration theory, changing the judicial system's language from Persian to English and making sure the government exclusively funded Western education. And the raw, unfiltered intent behind this policy is captured perfectly in this stated goal: to minimize the cultural gap by creating brown Englishmen, i.e., by blood Indian and by thought English. Wow. It really gives the ideological colonization some serious punch, doesn't it? And all of this eventually laid the groundwork for Wood's Dispatch in 1854, which is often called the Magna Carta of modern education, formalizing universities and education departments and permanently altering the cultural landscape.
Okay, so you've got the bureaucracy in place, and you've initiated this huge system of cultural and ideological control. But we have to remember the origins of our story here. This is a corporation, and corporations exist to make money. So, if you control the laws and you control the minds, how do you extract the absolute maximum amount of profit from the land?
Section 4. Extracting the wealth, the economic pillar. At the end of the day, profits drove everything. After winning the right to collect revenue back in 1765, the company experimented with how to squeeze the most wealth out of agriculture. Their most infamous system was the permanent settlement, which ran from 1786 to 1793. Just look at this revenue split. The zamindar, the traditional landlord, was given land rights and basically acted as a commission agent. But the math is staggeringly exploitative.
A massive 89% of the collected revenue was funneled straight into the British Treasury, leaving just a tiny 11% slice for the zamindar. And this matrix brilliantly illustrates the three distinct models the British used to suck this wealth out across different regions. In the permanent settlement in Bengal, they used the zamindar. But in the Ryotwari settlement over in Bombay and Madras, they bypassed middlemen entirely. They collected insanely high taxes, we're talking sometimes 50 to 60%, directly from the peasant or the ryot. And then in the Mahalwari settlement, it was a collective village responsibility where the village headman, the namandar, collected the revenue. Honestly, no matter the system, the goal of the whole shebang was identical: maximum extraction. To actually enforce this brutal extraction, the British rolled out these things called sunset laws under the permanent settlement. If a zamindar failed to deposit that massive revenue quota into the British Treasury by sunset on a specified date, boom, their land was immediately seized and auctioned off. The human cost here was absolutely catastrophic. It created this whole new class of absentee landlords who lived comfortably in cities and hired ruthless middlemen to squeeze the peasants even harder. The peasants themselves fell into deep, vicious cycles of debt, very often losing their land entirely to become landless laborers.
Section 5. The Road to 1857, the Pillars Collapse.
You just can't keep up this level of extraction and control without generating incredible friction. Over a century, the company basically engineered a massive pressure cooker. By the mid-19th century, think about what you had: absolute legal centralization with zero Indian representation. You had cultural alienation because traditional learning was sidelined. Down at the grassroots level, millions of peasants were drowning in debt, and at the elite level, traditional landowners were being dispossessed and humiliated by those sunset laws. The company had somehow managed to anger and squeeze every single level of society.
Which leaves us with a final lingering thought today. When a private corporation systematically builds an empire entirely on economic extraction, political marginalization, and cultural erasure, is violent rebellion the only inevitable outcome? The interconnected policies we explored today set the perfect stage for what would become the massive, explosive revolt of 1857, a moment that would finally bring the rule of the East India Company to a crashing halt. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I highly encourage you to keep exploring this incredible era of history,